Legend has it that King Edward II of England met his end in a way too gruesome to imagine. Murdered by the insertion of a red-hot poker into his body. This horrifying tale of humiliation has echoed through the ages, marking one of the most notorious royal deaths in history. But how did a reigning king find himself in such a nightmare, and did this dreadful fate really happen? It's a story of power, betrayal, and revenge, a cautionary tale that shows how even a king can fall prey to the darkest of human ambitions. Edward II's troubles began long before his final days. He was the son of the mighty Edward I, but strong leadership was not his forte. Early in his reign, Edward angered England's powerful barons by favoring personal favorites at court and sidelining the nobles. Infamously, he lavished wealth and titles on men like Hugh Despencer, and before him, Piers Gaveston, which infuriated the aristocracy and even alienated his own wife, Queen Isabella. The king also squandered his father's military gains, most notably suffering a crushing defeat to Robert the Bruce at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. To his opponents, Edward II was a weak ruler who had gifted away England's honor along with its power. By 1326, Queen Isabella of France, Edward's estranged wife, had run out of patience. She forged an alliance with her lover, the ambitious noble Roger Mortimer, and together they raised an invasion against Edward. The king's support crumbled rapidly. Edward was forced to flee, only to be captured and dethroned in a humiliating coup. In January 1327, under pressure from Isabella and Mortimer, he abdicated his crown to his 14-year-old son, now King Edward III. The once mighty monarch was now a prisoner of his enemies, a living threat to their new regime. Edward II was confined in chains and transported from one stronghold to another to prevent any loyalists from rescuing him. Eventually, he was placed in permanent captivity at a remote fortress, Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. There, the deposed king waited in darkness, unaware that the final act of his tragedy was looming. On the night of September 21st, 1327, King Edward II's fate was sealed behind the thick walls of Berkeley Castle. What happened in his cell that night would give rise to one of the most ghastly legends in English history. According to later chroniclers, Edward's jailers chose a method of murder designed to both horrify and leave no outward trace. The story goes that the king was pinned down and an assassin thrust a red-hot iron rod into his anus, mercilessly burning him from the inside. The cruel irony of this method was no accident. It was supposedly a deliberate reference to Edward's rumored homosexual relationships, particularly with his favorite Gaveston, a final hateful twist of the knife to humiliate the fallen king. Medieval accounts describe the agonized screams that allegedly echoed through the castle as Edward II was brutally put to death. By morning, the 43-year-old former king was dead, and his captors quietly announced that he had passed away in the night. That nightmare death scene, if true, would indeed make Edward II's demise the most horrible ever inflicted on a British monarch. But did it really happen that way? Almost immediately, whispers of foul play began to circulate. Suspicion was natural. After all, Edward was an anointed king who had died in custody under the new regime's watch. Few doubted that Isabella and Mortimer were ruthless enough to order a murder. In fact, Edward's body was quickly embalmed and shown only briefly to local officials, perhaps to dispel doubts that he was truly gone. He was then buried with royal honors in Gloucester Abbey that December, his young son King Edward III placing him in a grand tomb near the altar. Officially, the problem of the ex-king had been resolved, but the gruesome details of his end remained shrouded in mystery. The tale of the red-hot poker grew legs in the following years, spreading fear and fascination in equal measure. Not until after Roger Mortimer's downfall in 1330 did the lurid story truly catch fire. In October 1330, the now adult Edward III staged a coup against his mother's lover. Mortimer was arrested and executed for high treason. One of the charges was the murder of Edward II. It was only then, with Mortimer dead and unable to defend himself, that English chroniclers began circulating the shocking account of Edward II's death by anal torture. Many historians believe this was no coincidence. The red-hot poker murder story was likely propaganda, a smear campaign to blacken Mortimer and Isabella as monstrous killers. In reality, earlier sources either said nothing about foul play or hinted that Edward II had been quietly suffocated or strangled in his cell, a far less sensational end. Modern scholars generally dismiss the red-hot poker legend as improbable. They question why Edward's captors would use such a bizarre, risky method when a simpler death would have sufficed. No contemporary official report mentions the grotesque torture. The vivid details come from one main source, a chronicler named Geoffrey Le Baker, who wrote years later and was fiercely sympathetic to Edward. Baker portrayed the fallen king as a martyr undergoing diabolical torments in an almost religious drama of suffering. It made for a compelling story, but it was more imagery than verified fact. As historian Paul Doherty wryly noted, modern historians take the lurid description of Edward's death with more than a pinch of salt. Most likely, Edward II was murdered by more mundane means, probably suffocation, or even possibly died of ill health in captivity. We may never know the exact truth. What we do know is that Edward's violent end served the interests of those in power. Once he was gone, Isabella and Mortimer could rule unchallenged, at least for a time. In the aftermath, justice, of a sort, came full circle. Young Edward III eventually avenged his father. He overthrew Mortimer and restored honor to Edward II's memory. Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France, as later generations dubbed her, was spared execution but lived out her days in enforced retirement. Meanwhile, Edward II's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral became a site of pilgrimage as rumors swirled that miracles occurred there. Ironically, the disgraced king was later celebrated by some as a martyred saint, and efforts were even made, unsuccessfully, to have him canonized in the decades after his death. Such was the power of his legend. Was the horrible and humiliating death of King Edward II exactly as the legend tells? Probably not. But the fact remains that Edward II's life ended in tragedy. Taken away in the dark, betrayed by those closest to him, his story reminds us that in the tumultuous world of medieval politics, the mighty could fall in the most dreadful ways. And sometimes the truth behind a legend can be just as compelling as the legend itself. If you found this dramatic slice of history enlightening, please hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales of the past and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching, and be sure to check out our next video for another astonishing tale from history.